Good evening and welcome to the University of New England Center for Global Humanities. My name is Josh Pahigian. I'm a fellow here in the center, and I'm filling in tonight for my friend, many of you know him, most of you do, Anouar Majid, our founding director, who is watching live from Tangier, Morocco on our beautiful campus there. Anouar sends his regrets that he can't be with us tonight in person, but definitely know he's watching the live stream and he is certainly with us in spirit. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce our guest, Susan Lindee, who will present the third atomic bombing of Japan. Professor Lindee is a historian at the University of Pennsylvania who studies the historical and contemporary questions raised by human and medical genetics, science in the Cold War, nuclear weapons, and radiation genetics. She spent the fall 2014 semester as a visiting professor at Hiroshima University and has authored such books as Suffering Made Real, The DNA Mystique, and Moments of Truth in Genetic Medicine. Tonight, Professor Lindee will reflect on nuclear weapons, nuclear power, their biomedical risks, and their intertwined political history. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Susan Lindee.
Thank you for everyone at the Center for Global Humanities, and I especially want to thank our faraway witness, that is Anouar Majid in Morocco, and his students. So, and all of you, thanks to all of you for coming tonight to hear me speak. My title, as you can see, is The Third Atomic Bombing of Japan, Hiroshima, Fukushima, and Radiation Risk. The phrase, the third atomic bombing of Japan, comes from a quote that was given to the New York Times by representatives of the atomic bomb survivors groups at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the wake of the Fukushima nuclear meltdown. And in naming it that way, in that particular construction of the accident, this survivor was in essence drawing a connection between nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. If you know the history of the relationships between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, you know that often certain parties, including nuclear energy industry executives, have tried to draw a sharp line between the consequences and the risks posed by nuclear energy and weapons. And in putting it this way, the survivor was in essence drawing a connection not mediated by geopolitics, which is the common way that it's mediated, but through biomedical risk. That is, the risk of radiation exposure, the long-term biological effects of radiation, and the possibility that more populations would be exposed to radiation in much the same way that the atomic bomb survivors had been exposed. So I'm going to talk today about a story that has properties that I think this quote captures, the properties of both invoking history, imagining a certain future, and characterizing technoscientific problems in a way that focuses on biomedical risk. Here's the actual quote. Is it Japan's fate to repeatedly serve as a warning to the world about the dangers of radiation? I wish we had found the courage to speak out earlier against nuclear power. And this is survivor Masahito Hirose talking to the New York Times. When I heard the news of the accident at the nuclear power plant in Fukushima, I was stunned. It seemed as though the Japanese people were experiencing the third atomic bombing after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, it's important to realize that this debate, this question of the meaning of Fukushima for the atomic bomb survivors has only continued to shape policies and practices in Japan. And when I was there last fall, I arrived believing that I would work in some way on the history of the Radiation Effects Research Foundation since 1975, which is when it was renamed and reconfigured. But what I quickly learned is that all the operations of the contemporary Radiation Effects Research Foundation have been shaped by the new activism of the atomic bomb survivors and their new engagement with nuclear energy and their concerns with Japan's reliance on a network of nuclear energy plants. So, historians of science, which is what I am, often focus on the internal content of science in concert with the social, political, cultural, ethical, material, popular images or purposes or roles of technical knowledge. So if you think about the history of science, science is dependent on certain kinds of institutions. Historians study those institutions. And the work that scientists do, that engineers do, that physicians do, has consequences in the broader world. So it reaches out and it reaches down all the way into our daily lives. One way to think about it is that we live inside a techno-scientific world, and that techno-scientific world is very close to us. It's not out there just in the world of a nuclear energy policy. It's in the clothes we wear and the medical decisions we make and the information we have about environmental risk, and it's very deep. So I'm going to invoke the term archaeology. And I'm going to say that if you took contemporary life and you did an archaeology of knowledge for that contemporary life, you would see how thoroughly embedded we are and how all the things we do on a daily basis are shaped by the fact of the rise of technoscience and the implications of technoscience. So I mention that because I'm going to come back to it. One of my goals then, I think, is to denaturalize that. In other words, we take for granted our living in a techno-scientific world, and I want to get you to see it, that it's not necessarily, that it's a historical result. Now, the genetic effects of radiation were first recognized by a geneticist named H.J. Muller, who did some research with the common fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, in 1928 and 1929. And what Muller had been trying to produce mutations, the purpose was to understand heredity. He was using anything he could find, any kind of chemicals, any kind of poisons, and he ended up discovering that he could get his fruit flies to mutate if he irradiated them at a high enough level. He went around the world talking about this, and in 1946, Muller won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of the genetic effects of radiation. The reason that it was visible to the Nobel Prize Committee and of so much importance to so many people is that after the dropping of the atomic bombs in August of 1945, when the United States chose to drop the new weapon which had been developed in the United States on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was growing public concern and political concern about the possible genetic effects of radiation, and there was public support for major scientific study of these effects. Remember, what the bombings did was to create two very large populations of survivors. The scientists at Los Alamos had said nobody will survive. That was wrong. A lot of people survived. More than 200,000 people in the two cities survived the two bombings, either because they were behind something, they were hidden, they were somehow protected from the immediate first flash, which was fatal if you were exposed to it, but if you were shielded in some way, you had a chance of survival. And so for the Atomic Energy Commission, for Congress, for the President, the question of the long-term biological effects of radiation on people who had been so heavily irradiated was an important public policy question. And this is a picture of the Radiation Effects Research Foundation today. This is from the RERF website. You can see those little white buildings. Those are the semi-Quonset huts. They were supposed to be temporary housing for the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, which was its original name, in 1950, which is when they were built. The RERF is still there, still overlooking the city of Hiroshima, and still doing research on the atomic bomb survivors and now on the workers who were exposed at Fukushima. So the Radiation Effects Research Foundation was what we would call in history of science born transnational. So it was originally the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, but it was always understood to be a joint project between the United States and Japan. The problem was that the funding for the project until the 1970s came about 90% from the United States. And a second problem with that is that the the control of the scientific agenda, the control of all the research was entirely based in the United States, in Washington, D.C., where the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most prestigious scientific organizations in the world, oversaw the studies, and the money came from the Atomic Energy Commission. There are very few institutions in the history of science that came to be as disliked as the Atomic Energy Commission was. The AEC was mistrusted. It was seen as unreliable. It was seen as having a stake in downplaying or minimizing the genetic effects of radiation or the biological effects of radiation. And so this connection through the ABCSea between the National Academy of Sciences and the Atomic Energy Commission was a kind of an uncomfortable shotgun wedding. And when you look at the internal documents over and over again, the National Academy of Sciences is saying, we have to do it this way for it to be good science. And the Atomic Energy Commission is saying, you have to be careful because if you say that, you'll scare people, and that would have an impact on public acceptability of atmospheric weapons testing, which basically exposed everyone to some forms of radiation. So it was born transnational, but it was run by the United States, and it involved studying the survivors of the atomic bombings during the Allied occupation of Japan, which ended in 1952. Most of the people who worked at the ABCSea were Japanese, but the top tier was American almost exclusively. And at the beginning of the study, genetic effects of radiation were believed to be the most important likely effects. So this is just a picture of the key person. You can't see him very well, but he's in this train car. James V. Neal was the most important person for the genetic studies of radiation. And this was during his initial tour of Japan in the fall of 1946, which is when the scientists began to try to figure out how realistic it would be to do a long-term study in Japan at this time. Remember, there's many other things going on, lots of chaos, many needs in Japan. It wasn't so clear that this should be a high priority in these two cities. Now, how long is long term? Well, what's interesting about that is that at the beginning, the expectation was that if anything was there, they'd find it out in 3 or 4 years. So the plan was that during the occupation, the scientists would be in Japan. They'd do these quick epidemiological studies. They didn't expect to see anything. And almost immediately and really dramatically, by 1951, the ABCSea began to see strong, powerful signals for leukemia, extremely elevated leukemia risk in the atomic bomb survivors. And so at that point, it kept getting a little bit longer and longer. And if you look in the archives, you see over and over again, this is one of those institutions that's almost always about 20 or 25 years away from sunset. So one of the jokes about institutions in academia is that they're impossible to kill. This is an institution that even today, if you ask the director, how long will you still be around, they say 20 to 25 years. And that's because the role and the purposes of the RERF as it's known today have also changed. So this sunset, this horizon has changed, and the time frame has changed because now, increasingly since the 1970s, the Radiation Effects Research Foundation is seen as a global and international resource for planning and carrying out epidemiological research with any population that has been exposed to radiation. And what's happened in the wake of various nuclear accidents is that more populations have been brought into potential interest for the RERF. Now, the most important, this is the new facilities in 1950. So this is the height of the publication. The height of the staff, the numbers of staff for the ABCSea at this time. And this is also the year when survivor status was included in the Japanese census. So everybody who filled out a census form was asked if they were a survivor of the atomic bombings. One thing that many Americans don't know is that there was significant post-war discrimination against survivors. They were seen as unsuited marital partners out of the fear of genetic effects. They were seen as unlikely to be good workers because they would be sickly and weak and unable to work hard. So there was a lot of fear of, it was hard to get a job, it was hard to find somebody who wanted to marry you if you were a survivor, and therefore, for that reason, Many survivors in the immediate post-war period, if they possibly could, did not make it generally known that they were survivors. But the 1950 census asked this question and led to the identification of a very large cohort of survivors for the first time. This was so important for the ABCSea, and some of the elements of discrimination were lessening at this time, and people who had made it this far were generally, to be fair to the critics, if you had made it to 1950, you were probably one of the least affected survivors. Those who had been very heavily irradiated had possibly not been able to survive for that 5 years. And so you have a large cohort, and this cohort became the basis of the 1955 Francis report on creating a long-term fixed sample of survivors. This is considered the most important innovation in the ABCSea program because before that, the studies were not, they were a little bit incoherent. You studied who you could find, and what Francis said, and Francis was a very important virologist. He had worked on the flu vaccine, and he said you've got to have a fixed sample. You've got to find the proper matching of those who are close to the hypocenter, far from the hypocenter, and not exposed, and you've got to stay with them. You have to follow them through this for the long term. So he identified 150,000 people who became the focus of the lifespan, the adult health, and the mortality studies, and this became the basis of many of the most important papers that were produced by the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. Now, I want to pause for a minute and contemplate this unusual institution. Remember, we now have, the occupation was over in 1952. You now have an American scientific institution which is funded by the Atomic Energy Commission, which is operating in a foreign country, no longer under American occupation, and which is still run by the United States. It's mostly funded by the United States. And to add to it, it involves long-term epidemiological study with persons who are, by any measure, the victim of American technoscience. So they are people who were bombed, who were marked by radiation as a result of the use of a weapon that was produced in the United States in the context of war. So this is a very strange organization. Now, between the early 1960s and 1975, the financial pressures on the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission began to grow. So from 1963 to 73, the costs more than doubled and the staff declined. The U.S. contribution in 1972 was 1.25 billion yen, and the Japanese contribution was only 74 million. And at the same time, and in concert with these negotiations, the Atomic Energy Commission was encouraging Japan to invest in nuclear energy and offering Japan certain deals for nuclear fuel and nuclear energy technology and guidance if Japan would step up to the plate and begin to pay more for the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission's studies. And so in one of the internal discussions, Spofford English, who was a chemist who worked for the Atomic Energy Commission, tried to persuade Japanese political leaders that they should devote more money to the project because they were developing a nuclear energy industry, and one of those plants sooner or later was going to have some sort of a failure, and their own populations would be exposed to radiation, and therefore they would be very glad to have the data that was developed from the studies. So this is a justification. It's a kind of ironic justification. You should pay for studies of the atomic bomb survivors because you have a nuclear energy industry and something could go wrong with that industry. For whatever reason, and there were many other threads in this debate, eventually the Japanese Diet did approve becoming a full partner in the studies of the ABCSea, and that is when it basically became the Radiation Effects Research Foundation. One of the controversial issues in this new name was that it did not reference the atomic bomb. And some representatives of industry in Japan wanted it to continue to have the words atomic bomb included in the title. Radiation Effects Research Foundation opened it up to many different forms of radiation damage and different kinds of projects. So this is the ceremony in 1975, and this is, you can see there's basically the Quonset hut building in the back that's kind of curved. And this is the meeting of the first meeting of the Scientific Council, which was for the new Radiation Effects Research Foundation. The Articles of Incorporation for this new agency dictated that both the United States and Japan would share in the costs of running it and sponsoring it equally, but also that the management of the project would always be exactly divided evenly between Japanese scientists and American scientists. And so the scientific director and the full director cannot both be from the same nation. What this argument indexes is the perspective in the post-war period that your sympathies or your what we might call your sensitivity to radiation effects would be shaped by your own country's politics. And so in 1975, when the RERF stipulated that every committee had to have an equal number of Japanese scientists and American scientists, and furthermore, that no scientists from any third or neutral country could be included in any leadership role in the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, basically they were negotiating around the idea that the only legitimate, the scientists who had a legitimate interest in these events were from particular nationalist origins. Their nationalist origins would shape how much they would believe or how much they would claim about radiation effects. Remember, the Americans always took the position that the Japanese would be likely to overplay radiation effects, and the Japanese took the perspective that the Americans would be likely to downplay them because of the politics involved. So it was quite overt. And quickly at this point in 1975, and remember all this is coming together, the rise of the nuclear energy industry, increasing concerns about nuclear power around the world, the Radiation Effects Research Foundation became a resource for countries that were developing nuclear energy programs. And so scientists began to train at the RERF. Scientists even from the United States who were interested in questions of assessing radiation risk, making sense of it, were sent by the Department of Energy for classes at the RERF. So a kind of new expertise is coming out of the studies of the atomic bomb survivors. And when reactor number 4 exploded at Chernobyl in 1986, the Radiation Effects Research Foundation was immediately consulted in the earliest effort to figure out how to study the large populations that were conceivably exposed to elevated risk from radiation as a result of that accident. So Russian biologists came to study at the RERF, and immediately the director of the RERF, this is Itsusu Shigematsu, the chairman of the RERF, was called to lead the International Chernobyl Project, and this was an effort to pull together scientists from many different disciplines and many different countries to come up with a plan that would be reasonable for the study of those who had possibly experienced some kind of radiation exposure as a result of that accident. Remember, that was the most serious nuclear accident that we have ever experienced. There were millions of people who were exposed at different levels, but most people were probably exposed at relatively low levels. Now, I'm going to turn to Shigematsu's quote here. He says, "It may be no exaggeration to say that more than half of all the efforts made in Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the past 45 years to follow up the late health effects of the atomic bomb survivors has been devoted to the dosimetry program." And dosimetry is the effort to decipher how much radiation each point in your data set, each person had been exposed to. So you're trying to figure out what the relationship is between radiation exposure and given health outcomes. And in order to do that accurately, you've got to figure out how much radiation they experienced. But in order to do that, you have to know two things. You have to know how much radiation was released at the source, so how much came from the bomb or how much came from the reactor, And you've got to know where and when a particular individual is, because actual exposures could vary a lot based on where you were standing, whether you ate anything, how long you were there, what the doses were like at that exact place at that moment. So when Shigematsu says this, he's actually reporting on the struggle of the ABCC and the RERF to figure out these things. And I'm going to turn to this rather incredible story of dosimetry. You can't study any disaster. It is a fundamental part of any disaster surveys, and you can't study it unless you have done this work. Part of the problem was that at first, for the ABCC and RERF, the amount of radiation that had been released by the two bombs was withheld from the scientists at the ABCC, and that's because it was viewed as a state secret. Remember, the ABCC was funded by the Atomic Energy Commission. It was a state agency operating in Japan, but the radiation, there were two different kinds of mixes of radiation at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because the Hiroshima bomb was a gun-type bomb using uranium, and it had a different radiation footprint, if you will, and the Nagasaki bomb was an implosion bomb using plutonium, and both of those things were interpreted as secret because of fears about the Soviet Union getting the secret of the bomb. And so for a long time, and really into the early 1950s, the Atomic Energy Commission could not get the ABCC could not get a straight answer from the AEC on how much radiation had been released by those two bombs. And so at first, in all the early papers, when the leukemia appears, the metric is merely distance from the hypocenter. There's nothing about shielding. There's no attention to shielding. They don't know anything about shielding. They don't study shielding because they don't know how much the initial insult was. At one point, they even asked a physicist at Cornell to mine all of the published materials on the effects of on atomic bombs, anything he could find that was published, and come up with an estimate for them so they could at least talk about some order of magnitude within which this story would fit. Gradually, as the 1950s wore on, the United States and the Atomic Energy Commission came to the conclusion that these data could be released to the ABCC, and given that the Soviet Union already had the bomb, and there might not be any secret, and this might not be secret data. So beginning in about 1955, the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission had AEC data. It had data on what the bombs had released, and it also began to collect the equally important personal histories. And this is when the ABCC sent out teams which were consisted of mostly Japanese teams, so it would be someone to interview, someone to take a photograph, and someone to draw where the individual survivor was at the moment of detonation. That's the crucial moment for exposure. And so this led to the early radiation dosimetry estimates. This is a picture of one which appeared. This is technical report. It's 56, I think, is this one. This is 1960, when you can see that a Japanese house has been drawn with an individual inside the house. The slanted rays are coming in. This is the radiation coming in to affect this person. And one of the things they did with these interviews is not only to ask people, where were you at the moment of the bomb's detonation, but they also asked people to leave their place of work, which is where most of these interviews were conducted, and to bring the team to the actual spot in the city, in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, where they had been. This played a role in helping them to understand what that neighborhood had looked like, because their data were always a little bit incomplete around these questions. So this would be an entire, if you will, reenactment of what happened to you. How were you sitting? Were you laying on the floor? Which way were you facing? And these things mattered because the amount of radiation at the moment of detonation was there was such a difference between that moment of exposure and everything later, that knowing that your back was to the bomb would mean that the organs that were more accessible in your back would have a heavier exposure level. So you needed to know not only where somebody was, but whether they were curled up on the floor with their back to the hypocenter, whether they were facing it, what kind of materials were between them and the bomb. Very complicated question. Now, there was another type of reenactment, and this was a reenactment of the insult. So Plum Bob, what happened is that the Health Physics Division at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which, remember, was a part of the Manhattan Project and had a lot of people who knew about radiation effects. This was John Auxier at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, who began to stage reenactments of the atomic bombings at the Nevada test site. And in order to do this, and in order for it to be effective for the dosimetry studies, it was necessary to build Japanese houses in the desert in Nevada, and to put inside the Japanese houses dosimeters, which would be able to tell how high radiation levels were at any given place in the house, or with any given form of shielding. Part of the problem was that the researchers at Oak Ridge didn't know how to build a Japanese house. So they asked the people at the ABCSea to have a Japanese house built with the traditional building materials, which included mud and crushed shells and tatami mats and different kinds of, there were different kinds of tiles that would be used in Japanese housing. And they said, we need you to have someone build a traditional Japanese house. Japan is changing very rapidly. Post-war construction is not necessarily like the houses that were built before the war. And so they tried to find a traditional builder of Japanese houses who would use these materials. And the Auxier's plan at Oak Ridge was that the house would be built in Japan so that it was just right, so that it looked just like a Japanese house, then disassembled, shipped to Nevada, and rebuilt in the desert. The people at the ABCC were afraid that if the Japanese learned that Japanese houses were being built in Japan and shipped to Nevada to be bombed, there would be a public outrage around this matter. So instead, the ABCC collected tatami mats, tiles, the type of mud used in Japanese houses, and many kinds of shells, oyster shells that were crushed for these houses, shipped them all to Nevada, and the Nevada team, based on photographs and plans, built these houses in the desert. And they would then detonate basically a plutonium implosion type bomb to complete the reenactment and see what had happened inside the house. So this is filled with dosimeters. It doesn't have anybody in it or any animals. But eventually, Auxier and his colleagues figured out a way to save money. And they figured out that asbestos, then made by the Johns Manville Corporation, had exactly the same shielding properties of a standard Japanese house. So they began to build what they called analog Japanese houses. And this was in the hardtack test. These houses were built with asbestos. They looked kind of Japanese, but they were really only Japanese in one crucial parameter, and that was shielding properties. So they had nothing to do with Japanese life in the past or in the future, but rather with the shielding. Exactly how much radiation was shielded out was the same for asbestos as it was for mud and shell and other things that came from Japan. And it was a lot cheaper and easier to build houses in this way. Now, there were other houses built in the Nevada desert, and they call this, you can see here, a phantom house. And a phantom house was an American-style rambler split level, or this is it says here 2SWF, and that means two-story wood frame house. These were modeled on the new housing practices of American suburbia, and basically they were, you can't see it in this picture, but in some of the other pictures in this text, you can look inside the windows and see they were stocked with canned goods, they had refrigerators, they had furniture, they had lamps. So they were houses occupied only by future victims of a nuclear attack. That was the purpose of building these houses, and these two were bombed with the plutonium implosion bomb. One way I would put it is that there were no people in these houses when they were bombed, but the houses were occupied by techno-scientific ghosts. They were occupied by future victims of an imagined nuclear apocalypse who were represented by the sensors which could record anticipatory calculable damage, cancer or heart disease, and radiation monitors placed around the rooms in these phantom houses were standing in for phantom human beings, people whose health had already been or would be compromised by radiation exposure. Remember that atmospheric weapons testing in the course of the 1950s deposited a layer of irradiated materials virtually everywhere, all over the world. When the scientists at the Radiation Effects Research Foundation wanted to figure out something about pre-radiation levels in Hiroshima and in the Japanese countryside, they had to find places that were under houses throughout the term of the Cold War atmospheric weapons testing. So basically, everybody has already been exposed to slightly elevated levels of radiation, and as a result of the consensus in the scientific community, and it's a consensus that is as much political as technical, but it's a consensus that there is no level of elevated radiation that poses no risk, and this is the linear non-threshold hypothesis. LNT, linear non-threshold, is the international standard for worker exposure, for medical exposure, for patient exposure. So the assumption is that every exposure to radiation can, in theory, have some effect on those who are exposed. So here are these ghosts in these houses that are being turned into models, or they're standing in for people who will either be bombed in the future, and that was part of the basis of it, or people who could be the victims of nuclear energy accidents. There was one other major effort to decipher dosimetry in a more accurate way, and this is underway right now. So we're 70 years out from the bombings, and this paper has not yet appeared. I talked to the people at the Radiation Effects Research Foundation who were working on it, and they shared it with me. What happened with there were 4 cities that were going to be bombed, and the strategic bombers were taking multiple overlapping photos of these cities because it would be important after the bombing to understand what had happened in the cities, how far had the damage gone, what had been there before, could you see the difference between houses of certain materials and buildings of certain materials. And so there were multiple aerial photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which had been pieced together to make a large map of the 2 cities. So each of these overlapping photos had been pieced together to make these large maps, which were used to place every survivor in different places on the map. But what the scientists and statisticians at the RERF realized, I guess about 4 years ago, is that these maps, because of the distortions of 1940s era aerial photography, because they often involve pictures that were taken at slightly different heights or angles, because the quality of some photos was better than others, these maps either included corners that didn't actually exist, that were not in the original city 70 years ago, or they left out places. People would try to find themselves on the map, and they would say, there was a huge building there. You don't have that building that I was in, and where is it? And so they began to realize that the maps, while they were a really good rough guide to what the 2 cities were like, they were not accurate enough for the purposes to which the RERF was trying to put them. And so they undertook a digital reconstruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what has happened over the last 2 years is at great expense and effort, these 2 ghost cities, more or less, have come back into existence, every single street corner. And they can do this by using many different photographs, correcting for angle, correcting for lack of focus. And they've created an entirely new orthophotographic mosaic of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they also then put the grid over this orthophotographic mosaic. And what had happened in earlier placement of survivors was that survivors had been generally, for convenience, they had been moved to the cross points on the grid. So each survivor has a number that clarifies where exactly they were, and they had kind of been moved into the cross points. They took them off the cross points. They used that number, and they actually placed each survivor on this new grid in this new photograph, and every single one of the 93,000 survivors they placed in this way moved, every one. Sometimes they only moved a few feet, but they all moved. So you might ask yourself, what is this work about? And why is it worth the time of a large staff at the RERF to make the effort to remap so many people on these large-scale maps with so much detail? The reason it matters is that the part of radiation risk that is most relevant for public policy, most relevant to moving forward, is low-dose exposure. Everybody knows that high-dose exposure is bad for you. There's no question. There's some point at which everybody knows you get that level of exposure, your risk goes up. And so there's no debate, there's no fight about high-dose exposure, but there is a vexing public policy debate about what levels of low-dose exposure are safe. And following it this way, getting every survivor exactly where they were, could be conceivably relevant to this low-dose debate. So that's sort of what they were trying to do. Now, this is a picture of the distribution of doses in the lifespan study group of survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what you can see when you look at this map is how the nature of the bomb mattered, but also how terrain matters. Hiroshima is flat. It's on a river delta. It has 7 or 8 rivers that run right through the middle. It's many islands. There were very few bomb shelters in Hiroshima because it was difficult to build a bomb shelter because of the water level, the water table. It's basically on a delta. And Nagasaki had a lot of bomb shelters, and a lot of people were protected. The largest single group of survivors very close to the Hypo Center were in Nagasaki, and they were inside a military facility underground. They weren't trying to get away from the bomb. They were working underground. I think it's the arsenal, or maybe it was the steelworks. So that's their largest group of survivors very close. But most people in Nagasaki were protected in some way because the bomb was dropped into the Urakami Valley, and there were many ways to be protected, by the stone, by the valley. There were more buildings in that particular place. So a very different distribution picture of doses, and also more highly exposed survivors in Hiroshima because of those geographical qualities in that city. Now, all epidemiology of disaster risk by its nature requires this kind of reconstruction, the reliving or rehearsing of a critical moment in both techno-scientific and sociological terms. And one of the things that's clear is that this kind of work requires technical expertise, but it also requires imagination, creativity, almost an artistic sense of how to visually characterize relationships and risk matters. Now, I'm going to skip that one. The research of the RERF and the ABCSea is generally considered the gold standard for biological effects of radiation research, and that's partly because the ABCSea in the early years very quickly documented all these other effects. It's leukemia, it's solid tumors, eventually heart disease, lifespan effects. And basically, the ABCSea RERF, the data produced by this one agency, is the basis of all of these protection legislation all over the world. It is considered the only reliable, such a large population, high radiation exposures, long-term study. This is a long epidemiological study. And so the data are very good coming out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All right. Now, the scientists at the RERF played a critical role in planning long-term studies of Chernobyl, and they're now, as I mentioned, involved in long-term studies for the workers at Fukushima, not for the residents of the affected prefectures, but for the workers, because the workers are the only ones whose exposure levels are believed to be high enough to, in all likelihood, get long-term biological effects of the type that the RERF knows very well. Now, Fukushima also mattered to the atomic bomb survivors, and it mattered because they reached out immediately to those who'd been affected at Fukushima, and they began to see a common experience. Every anniversary of the atomic bombings at Hiroshima, individuals who come to the anniversary, and I was there in this past August for the 70th anniversary, can buy a beautiful paper lantern that has a candle on the inside, and the tradition is to write a message of peace on the colored paper lantern and then release it out into the river. And I'm sure you've seen these beautiful pictures of the river with all the floating candle lanterns. But in 2011, the recommendation was that visitors write on those lanterns messages opposing nuclear energy. So it was a transformation from a focus on peace to a focus on controlling nuclear energy. The Japan Confederation of A and H bomb survivors, with about 10,000 member survivors, made a formal appeal to the government of Japan to eliminate civilian nuclear power. This came in about 2012. One member told reporters that, quote, "The bureaucracy, industry, and media were able to shut our eyes to the danger of nuclear power. We let them fool us, even in this country that was the victim of the atomic bomb. They convinced us that nuclear power was different from nuclear bombs. Fukushima showed us they are not so different." Survivors' organizations also demanded that the Fukushima affected residents be given government support for medical care. One of the most tragic elements, many tragic elements of the survivor story is that basically the government of Japan did not provide them with medical care until a new law in 1959, and the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission did not provide medical care either because of the idea that medical care was not appropriate for a scientific organization. So the survivors struggled to get medical care, and they've transformed that struggle into something that is an advocacy role with those who are exposed at Fukushima. So Fukushima is now a place in kinship with Hiroshima, Bikini, Hanford, Chelyabinsk, Semipalatinsk, Chernobyl, and these are places, geographical locations, which constitute a different kind of nuclear club. So we usually think of the nuclear club as the superpowers, the states that have nuclear weapons. This is a nuclear club characterized by contamination and risk, radiation risk. Fukushima was not the worst nuclear accident in history, as I mentioned, but it is unquestionably the most complicated, and because of the combination of the tsunami and the earthquake. And the Brookings Institute has characterized it as the most costly disaster in history. It has had many wide-ranging effects. Now, in the history and social study of medicine, scholars began in the 1970s to articulate the notion of a new social role, which they called a patient in waiting. A Patient in Waiting was produced by uncertain medical diagnostics and by commercial networks that invested the individual with responsibility for the management of his or her own future health. Each individual came to be seen as potentially ill, always in a state of potential illness, and expected to seek treatment roughly to avoid having to seek treatment. So it's the patient in waiting who is subject to medical surveillance, but also responsible due to poor diet, lack of exercise, and stress for his or her own medical condition. And always on the brink of being, so the patient in waiting is a person in an uncertain diagnostic state, always on the brink of turning into a patient because of a new test or new information. It postulates that a new notion of extreme vigilance about one's own health became a critical part of this new role, and It was also a circumstance monetized in terms of both testing and therapeutic interventions. This may sound familiar to you, how we live in terms of testing and the monetary impetus to be responsible for your own future health at all time. I want to close by suggesting that we have all become survivors in waiting as well. The survivor in waiting is the individual embedded in complex and uncertain technoscientific systems that are prone to failure. Nuclear energy and nuclear weapons systems might be seen as typical of such technoscientific systems. There are 437 nuclear power plants around the world, and there are dozens more that are under consideration or in development in many different places. Nuclear energy is a very seductive technoscience because it can generate large amounts of energy, and economic development is dependent very directly on access to energy. And so this is sort of, remember too, and we can talk about this, the reason for the meltdown at Tohoku at the nuclear power plant was because access to a much older technical system, and that is the standard electrical grid, was interrupted by the disruption of the tsunami, the earthquake, the fact that no trucks could get to the plant, and the fact that its backup generators, the plant itself had been built in the Midwest, and it was considered safe against tornadoes, and its backup generators were in the basement. And when the tsunami breached the wall, which was not high enough for that level of tsunami, it flooded the basement, ended access to the backup generators, and the lack of electrical power is what caused the meltdown because it was impossible to keep them cool. And in this very rapidly and confusing circumstance. So when I say the archaeology of technoscience, one way to think about it is that the entire nuclear power system is embedded in an older technical system, which is the standard electrical grid. And the assumption in nuclear energy circles is that there will be no circumstances in which it is not possible to get emergency electrical power to a plant. And what Fukushima showed is that there could be circumstances in which it was not possible, in which a combination of a natural disaster and a technical disaster, very brave crew that stayed there and tried to contain the damage, exposing themselves to very high levels of radiation, but could not do it without that electrical power. And in the end, of course, the reactor was flooded with seawater, which is what prevented an even worse outcome. So what I want to close with is to say that we live in a world in which technological infrastructure itself contributes to potentially enormous changes in the natural world. We have increasing population density, and there are militaries and terrorist groups that could be interested in the consequences of causing this technological infrastructure that we live inside and to collapse. And we have become survivors in waiting. We are allied with the atomic bomb survivors, with those at risk at Fukushima, and with many others. The stories of Hiroshima and Fukushima resonate across both time, the past, and the future, and they call us to notice our present conditions. Epidemiology without end. And there's me. Thank you.
We'll open it up now to some audience Q&A time. I'll just remind members of our audience to speak really right into the microphone so that everyone can hear. And my friend Stephen Carroll on the other side of the room will join me in circulating microphones as needed. So who would like to start us off tonight with a question for Professor Lindee? Here you go, sir.
Yeah, I have a question about the cultural acceptance of, for instance, my brother lives in Washington State around Hanford, which you mentioned, and the people of that community, he was a state rep, and the people of that community just make fun of the whole thing. Their attitude towards it, living there, continued living there, is amazing to me. And I mean, if I lived there, I'd move. But it's still just like that place in Washington or in Montana, I think, where there's the asbestos. And when I was there a couple years ago, and you drive up to the gas pumps, and it says before you drive into the town, it says you may be exposed to asbestos if you want to get gas. So my question is about the cultural acceptance of the risks that Americans and other people take.
Yes, it's a fascinating question because what we see in communities that are at risk, for example, Hanford, remember, as I'm sure you know, Hanford was a major employer, and many people devoted, and people at these facilities have loyalties to the weapons programs. They have loyalties that are grounded in a long commitment to the necessity, for example, of creating nuclear weapons, of sustaining the nuclear arsenal of the United States. And it's not, even with my historical distance, it is difficult for me. I think the United States did overdo it with the weapons program, but it was necessary for the United States to sustain a credible threat against the Soviet Union. It was not a wholly inadequate or ridiculous pursuit to do this. And when when Hanford was being built in the early years, when it was being expanded, there was also a strong policy of keeping people, I'll use the word advisedly, but ignorant, I think is the correct word. So there was a lot of propaganda so that individuals who worked at places like Hanford didn't necessarily understand the full nature of the risks that they were engaged with. And they would hear that everything was fine, that there were no risks at their level. Remember that in the same period, many, many American soldiers were sent into the Nevada test site right after detonations, and they were sent in because the claim was that the only thing to fear in the wake of the next nuclear war would be the fear that would be generated, the irrational fear people would have about exposure to radiation. So the soldiers had to be sent into the Nevada weapons tests in order to prove that there were no risks, and that they just had to get over, it was just psychological. They had to get over their fears. What I suspect in the case you're asking about Hanford today, and what I suspect is that for many people, there are family ties, there's a long history of having worked there, there's a certain amount of not noticing or of denial, or there may be elements of patriotism and loyalty to the facility and all that it did for the community such as it was. Remember, nothing much was out there before Hanford was built there. But it is mysterious. I mean, it's almost a sociological question that you're asking. That is, how does any community come to tolerate a given risk factor? And, you know, I have a son who lives in Los Angeles, and I say, how do you live with those earthquake risks, okay? So people in different locations come to terms with different kinds of risks, and maybe it doesn't bother them. My favorite one is, for tolerance of risk, my favorite example is riding an automobile or driving an automobile. You may or may not know that, but every time you get in an automobile, your life is at stake. So basically, it's a very high-risk activity, but we all do it all the time. I drive all the time, and I know perfectly well how dangerous it is to drive a car. So I can't answer your question entirely, but I recognize that it is a very interesting question about how history and risk and ignorance and knowledge work together to shape the meanings of any given insult, if you will. We can call that it's a source of insult to the body. Yeah.
Question back here.
How quickly did the radiation levels in Hiroshima and Nagasaki fall after the bombs were dropped? And would it make any sense to study the effects of radiation in people who subsequently repopulated these cities, people who may not have been there when the bombs were dropped, but came into this area afterwards?
You know, you have asked one of the most controversial questions about the studies of the atomic bomb survivors, because there's a category of person called an early entrant. And an early entrant was somebody who rushed into the city within hours or maybe even minutes of the bombings to try to find loved ones. So there were a lot of people out in the country who could see that something terrible had happened in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and who had family members or businesses or owned homes in these two cities and rushed in, and in some cases, as we would assess it today, they were wandering around these two cities at a time when there was plenty of radioactive dust. There was, while the initial blast was over, and that was the most dangerous time, if you came into the city, it would have been possible at least to be exposed to an elevated risk from the radiation. Not at the same level as someone who was directly exposed or more proximally exposed, but nonetheless some exposure. And so the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission and the RERF have never studied the early entrants. Studying the early entrants would require an entire different level of bureaucratic surveillance, because they were not asked necessarily, people who were early entrants were not asked if they were in the two cities at the time of the bombings. That was the question on the 1950 census. So you would have to find them based entirely on testimonials. You would have to ask a large number of people, where did you go, what did you do, did you drink any water, did you eat anything? And they've made the decision that it would not be particularly productive to try to do that. There's also a sense, and this is not just relating to the atomic bomb survivors, you know that for any tragedy, for any disaster, for any reconstruction, even for something as simple as, if we were all asked an hour later to describe what happened in this room, we'd probably all have a different story. And so, but for disasters, people remember selectively. It's been a long time. Their memories are not good. By the time this debate began, it was about 10 years after the bombings. Do people really remember what they did? So the answer to your second question is, the question of what happened to early entrants is unresolved. But it's very likely that some people who came into the city received significant enough radiation to have some symptoms of radiation sickness. People reported that. They said they came in and they got sick. They lost hair, they had subcutaneous bleeding, they had nausea, so they had the GI effects, they had the hair effects, and they were not in the two cities at the time of the bombings. Your first question was how quickly the radiation dissipated, and that's related to the second one. But I can say that it was fast. It was a week. There was no higher risk in Hiroshima or Nagasaki within a couple of months at best. So it just dissipated. You could track it in some places, you could find it, but the difference is that it was a type of radiation where there was a massive, very high pulse, and then, especially in Hiroshima, a day-long fire. So much of the debris, what that fire did was to take irradiated debris and send it up into the atmosphere. And so, because basically it burned, the whole city burned horribly. Many people died in the burning, and it didn't start burning for about 2 hours, 2.5 hours. So it's a very chaotic circumstance, but the city did not stay irradiated. There was one reservoir that had some irradiation as late as about 1950, where water had collected the radiation. And when I talked with people in Fukushima Prefecture about how they're thinking about this distribution of radiation, how it moves through an environment, it gets pulled up into the trees, and then when the trees lose their leaves in the fall, radiation readings are higher on the ground where the leaves are. Or it collects in the ravines. So I walked around Fukushima City with the director of Fukushima Medical University study, and he took me to his house because he wanted me to see the little ravine in front of his house, because he said it's actually dangerous right there. So it's not, when we think of radiation risk, we think of a sort of a solid blanket of risk. But in fact, it's constantly changing, and it moves with wind and trees and water and the changing seasons. And that's part of the complexity of studying it as well when you're talking about radiation that's widely distributed over large areas that's not always the same even every day.
I have a question from an undergraduate student here.
You kind of touched on this at the end, but what is the potential threat that terrorists pose in concern to them getting their hands on nuclear weapons or nuclear energy? Like, what would that look like?
Well, I think that what I was referring to at the end was the threat that, and I hate to even say this out loud, and I know this is going on the internet too, but it's the threat that if you shut down, there are 437 nuclear power plants around the world. If you could effectively shut down the power grid access to those plants, in all likelihood, you could get at least some of them to go critical. And if the Fukushima plant had gone further, if there had been a complete meltdown, basically much of Japan would be uninhabitable. I mean, there's the potential, which is a relatively, I mention it because it's so low tech. We usually, when we think about nuclear risk, we're thinking about people getting access to plutonium and weapons-grade plutonium and being able to build a nuclear weapon. And what I want to point out is that the nuclear energy system is vulnerable, has lots of nuclear materials, and can be, with something as simple as a long-term and effective shutdown of the energy grid, you can set off a cascade of failures. They all have backup generators, and in the wake of Fukushima, there's actually been a huge effort to ramp up all the backups for the electrical grid. This is part of what the National Research Council said when they did this massive study of what had happened there and why it had happened and how it could be prevented in the future. And this question of a relatively, how old is the electrical grid? Who remembers their history? The electrical grid is, in some places, the most recent it is 100 years, and in some places it's 150 years old. This is an old technological system that we have been dependent on for the last century and a half, and this old system is critical to this new techno system. So that's, when I talked about us being sort of embedded in techno-science, that's part of what I mean. Now, the question of whether a terrorist group could get access to an actual bomb, I don't actually know. Somebody may know how that works or who could do that. I think it's entirely possible, although I don't think it's the most effective way to bring us down. I think you can bring us down by getting at these techno-scientific systems better, more large scale.
Question over here.
Are studies being done on the children and grandchildren of the survivors, not just children that were in utero at the time of the explosion, but subsequently conceived and born children?
Yes, that's called the F1 study, and it is the F1, that is the first generation born after the bombing. In utero, it's interesting that you raised that question, because in utero exposed are viewed as survivors, and they are survivors who were shielded by the mother's body. So there were, I think, 5 classes of survivors, and 1 class is in utero exposed. And many in utero exposed babies were fine, but if you were exposed to radiation at a certain crucial moment in development, and I'm going to get the weeks wrong, I think it's 6 to 9 or 6 to 10, those babies at that crucial moment ended up with severe mental retardation. It had to do with the point of development that they were in and the high level of exposure. So the in utero are considered survivors. They were already present, so to speak, in the 2 cities. And the F1 are the offspring of all registered survivors. They have been studied pretty much nonstop since 1947, which is when Neil began the genetic studies. And today, the F1, the second generation, provides information on things like lifespan, contemporary health, cancers. So they're still in the database, and their children are also being included in the database. Now, here's the mystery. Genetic effects of the atomic bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki have never been detected at a statistically significant level. And the only number, when James Neal and his colleagues were trying to figure this out in the early years, so remember, they don't start this until 47, which means there could be people they missed between 45 and 47. There could be children they missed. But when they start it fairly early, they detect in atomic bomb survivor families slightly reduced fertility. And they start to think fertility could be a surrogate. Fertility can be a surrogate for a lot of different things. Fertility can fall because of poverty. It can fall because of stress. There are a lot of ways fertility can go down. But they began to wonder if the slight reduction in fertility was a sign of early spontaneous abortion that would have been maybe more likely for babies who had some sort of an abnormality that was produced by the atomic bombings. That's the only data point they ever got. In terms of every other parameter, that is abnormality, physical abnormality, anything else you could track or see, and even later electrophoretic tests and tests with DNA and everything you can do, they never found statistically significant results. So the reigning conclusion now is it goes something like this. There were genetic effects of radiation in the atomic bomb, in the offspring of the atomic bomb survivors. There were, because there have been genetic effects of radiation in absolutely every other animal ever studied. There are such effects. But in human beings, for whatever reason, given the limitations of this study, they couldn't find them. They couldn't see them. So there weren't dozens or hundreds of, monstrous births. That didn't happen.
We'll take 2 more questions, starting with this gentleman right here.
Hi. So I have a question that sort of asks about the context of nuclear energy in the broader spectrum. So in the history of nuclear energy, there's been 3 incidents. 3 Mile Island, which was, pretty much a fender bender.
Right.
Chernobyl, which was an accident where they shut down the security systems intentionally, and it, as an experiment, failed, and then Fukushima. But on the other side of the coin, the other energy resources that we have, oil, the other fossil fuels, every few years there's a major oil spill. I'm sure, I don't know the numbers, but I would speculate more people have died from coal lung than radiation exposure, black lung, and fracking is now a big issue. And then sort of all of that aside, you have the emissions of carbon dioxide, which are threatening in the next 50 years a lot of coastal ecosystems and all of the coastal cities. So I guess in that context, do you think that nuclear energy is more detrimental or more dangerous? And considering that we can learn from Fukushima, and that was just a perfect storm of backup system and safety system failing. So do you think that going forward, nuclear energy is something that should still be considered, or, because the other options aren't great as well?
Yeah, all the options. As you suggest, I think you should devote yourself to the study of these problems and try to figure out how to move us forward. Because what I can tell you is that given where we are in terms of energy consumption, it's probably our only option because we use a lot of energy. So if we want to sustain the same level of energy consumption that we're doing now, you're right, coal's a disaster. My state, Pennsylvania, is filled with fracking. It has been transformed by fracking, and it's not in a good way, as they say. So how do you figure out what are your options? And I found a wonderful internal planning document that said that the only solution for avoiding nuclear attack, and this is during the Cold War, was to move everybody out of cities and back to a rural agrarian society, because that way you can't bomb a farm. I mean, you can, but you can't do the kind of damage that you can do to an urban center. So dial the clock back on society, move us all to farms, churn our own butter, that would be so the question is, how do we solve the problem of high population, all the problems with other energy forms, and is there a way to manage nuclear energy in a way that is not as risky, not as dangerous? And one of the things, I learned in traveling around Asia is that places where economic development, where they don't have the kind of economic development we have, they want nuclear power plants like yesterday, because that's going to be the key for moving into the modern global economy. And And you can listen to those accounts and you can be sympathetic for what would animate them. The fact, you want to be able to maybe change your standard of living for whatever reason. And so we're kind of stuck. And I'll close my little commentary by mentioning that many of this entire system, remember, how and why do we have nuclear energy plants? Do you know why? Do you know where nuclear energy came from? Well, the peaceful uses of the atom. Okay, so after the atomic weapons had been built at Los Alamos, and remember, who's at Los Alamos? 33 of the best physicists in the world. 22 Nobel Prize winning physicists, all those emigres, all the Jewish physicists from Germany who lost their jobs in April of 1933, who were terrified that Heisenberg is going to build a bomb for Hitler, they're all at Los Alamos ecstatically building the bomb as quickly as they can. All the brilliant chemists at Berkeley, the mathematicians, the statisticians, even psychologists were involved in trying to figure these things out. This is science at its best. But once the bomb had been produced and there was the backlash against the use of the bomb, the United States began to want to promote a positive outcome from what, by any measure, even if you supported the use of the bomb against Japan in 1945, the actual use of the bomb gave some energy to the arms race. And energized the Soviet Union and made it more important for the Soviet Union to very rapidly get more and more weapons. So when I say we live in a system where I'm talking about the archaeology of technoscience, nuclear energy is technoscience at its best and at its worst.
That seems like a good note to end on. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Susan Lindee for her time tonight.